We're in probably the two most famous chapters of Ezekiel. We did Ezekiel 38 last week, and we're doing Ezekiel 39 tonight. So here's our little review. If you remember, we found out an aha moment. Most people always want to know who and where are the countries and what are the countries' names today, who's going to be involved in this war called the War of Gog and Magog against Israel. And we found out Revelation chapter 20, verses 7 and 8 actually tips the hand of who Gog is. If you remember in chapter 38, it was the prophecies against Gog over and over. And Revelation tells us that he is a demon king spirit over the land. And so he is over the land of Turkey and over the land of what we would know today as Russia. It's a spirit. You see this a lot in the New Testament where there are certain demons that are regional demons. Well, this seems to be the demon of war that's over that area. And so Revelation actually tells us after Jesus has reigned for 1,000 years and the devil is loose, in verses 7 and 8, it says not only is the devil released, but Gog is released once again. So many of you might have grown up learning, you thought Gog was like going to be Putin of Russia and Magog is Russia. Gog, we don't know who the person is because it's just like the Antichrist. He will be someone that is inhabited by a demon spirit, and it really represents Gog is the demon spirit. Who the person ends up being is kind of like an afterthought on that. So the second thing we learned was the names of the countries that are involved in this invasion that takes place are actually found in Genesis chapter 10. You go to the sons of Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, as you look at their descendants and where the descendants went out into the land, that's how the Bible names those areas, is because names of countries and places changed, but the descendants that went to those areas stayed the same, and that's kind of how Genesis 10 is a key to Ezekiel 38, and Revelation 20 is the second key to it. So you know the countries that will be involved. Yes, they are today modern day names like Libya, Syria, Turkey, Iran, and Russia. There are some of the ones that you had the map and all that last week. So when God shows up, though, we learn this. When God shows up for a great battle, he will shake the earth. This is God physically getting involved in the first time that we know of. I'm not saying God didn't intervene in different wars like World War I and World War II, but he's declaring he is the one that's going to make everybody, the whole world, know who he is through this specific battle, okay? And so God's greatness and holiness is proven in the battle. Very significant things. Most of the times when you have a battle and a war, you say, it's these people against these people, and this was the outcome. Interestingly, Ezekiel 39 goes a little beyond that. It goes deeper. You now know who the battle is against. It's against Israel, and these countries are coming, and the spirit, the demon spirit of Gog is coming. And yet, in chapter 39, God wants to kind of pull back some of the layers to show you what's behind all this. And that's what chapter 39 is all about. So let's pick it up now in chapter 39 and look at the first 6 verses. Watch, again, he's still prophesying against who? Verse 1, Son of Man. Son of Man is speaking to Ezekiel. It actually means son of dust, the one created from God's hand. Son of man, prophesy against Gog and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against you, Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. I will turn you around and drag you along. I will bring you from far north and send you against the mountains of Israel. Now, if you're reading the King James, you've noticed up here that in verse 2, I highlighted the drag you along, because King James really actually does a better job interpreting this, where it says that it's actually something's going to happen to the land of Magog and to the spirit of Gog and all the rest. And we'll pick that up here in just a few moments. Verse 3. Then I will strike your bow from your left hand and make your arrows drop from your right hand. On the mountains of Israel you will fall, you and all your troops and the nations with you. I will give you as food to all kinds of carrion birds, basically vultures and to wild animals. You will fall in the open field, for I have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. I will send fire on Magog. Okay, that's the region or the land, which is Russia. I will send fire on Magog and on those who live in safety in the coastlands. Now in the King James it says in the isles. Who are those people? We're going to look at that here tonight. And they will know that I am the Lord. All right. So the Gog invasion details is what we're getting here in chapter 39. And the first verse tells us again, God continues to prophesy against the spirit of Gog, this demon spirit of war, that he prophesies again against him. Verse 2 in the King James actually gives this detail. It says that Gog will be decimated in this war. Okay? That's what the drag you along in the NIV really didn't spell out what's going to happen to Gog there. The King James Version does a much better job of telling you that there's going to be this decimation of the spirit of Gog and his ability to make war. All right? Their arrows or missiles will fall to the ground. Arrows or missiles will fall to the ground. In chapter 38, they called it the horses and the chariots of war. In the Hebrew, they're called Merkava. All right? You're going to see by your pictures what that means. And in verse 6, it says, a fire will be sent to the land, which is the land of Magog, Russia, and to in the King James, to the isles, or in the NIV, to the coastal lands. So, what's all that about? How interesting how God puts things through a prophet that could only understand bows and arrows, horses and chariots in his day, but how God then allows the future to go, aha. The picture that you see right here at the very bottom here, the air defense missile hits target and test. Israel's air defense missile defense is called the arrows. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, the missiles are called what? The arrows. The next picture, I already told you that the chariot word is Merkava. Their state-of-the-art tank that they're very proud of in Israel, they've named it the Merkava, which means chariot. Oh, all of a sudden, Ezekiel 38 and 39 became modern warfare, didn't it? The arrows are missiles, and the Merkavas, the chariots are tanks. Wow, that is really, really interesting. So we see all of a sudden God knows, and why would he put that in the heart of this nation that gets birthed after 1,800 and plus years of being gone, that they would call their missile defense the arrows and their tanks, the Merkava, the chariots? Why? So that God could sit back and smile and say, yep, I told you about that war, didn't I? All right, so now you kind of are catching a different part of it. And when people go, oh, well, then you can't take the Bible literal. I don't know. Since arrows is their defense, and the arrows are going to fall, and they're for Israel, that's their missiles. What's falling for the demon Gog, his missiles, and all the rest that are coming from all these other countries that are going to fall? They're the arrows that I believe are missiles. You see how it's very easy to put these pieces together. This is not rocket science. This is just putting together what God has laid out for us very, very clearly here. I alluded to that the land is going to be on fire, and I didn't put this in your notes yet at this point because I wanted you to get this next section in. We're going to come back to the land that's on fire after this war, the land of Magog, which would be Russia, and the isles, okay? But let's pick it up now in verses 7 through 18. Verses 7 and 18. Look who's who's making known what's happening here? I is not Ezekiel. This is God. I will make known my holy name among my people. I love that, don't you? I will no longer let my holy name be profaned, and the nations will know that I, the Lord, am the Holy One in Israel. It is coming. It will surely take place, declares the sovereign Lord. Now watch this phrase. If we're going to talk about the timing of this war, this is not solid in scholars and especially in eschatology and those that study this. This is the day I have spoken of. Ooh, what day could that be? This is the day I've spoken of. Then those who live in the towns of Israel will go out and use the weapons for fuel. These are the ones that fell earlier in the chapter here. They will use the weapons for fuel and burn them up, the small and the large shields, the bows and the arrows, the war clubs and the spears. For 7 years they will use them for fuel. They will not need to gather wood from the fields or cut it from forests, because they will use the weapons for fuel. And they will plunder those who plundered them and loot those who looted them, declares the sovereign Lord. Okay, so what the enemy came to do, God's allowing Israel to get the victory in that. Verse 11. It comes back to that phrase there, on that day. That's important. So in Hebrew thinking, to have a good witness, you have to have two. So when you see a witness in the Bible where it repeats something pretty quickly there, it becomes the biblical witness that this is important. Okay? So it comes back to this in verse 11. On that day, I will give Gog a burial place in Israel. In the valley of those who travel east of the sea, it will block the way of travelers, because Gog and all of his hordes will be buried there. So it will be called the valley of Haman, Gog. And Haman actually means hordes of God. Hordes, H-O, if you're hearing my Philadelphian there, H-O-R-D-E-S, okay? Hordes of Gog, all right. For 7 months, the Israelites will be burying them in order to cleanse the land. Very important key there. To do what? To cleanse the land. All the people of the land will bury them, and the day I display my glory will be a memorable day for them, declares the sovereign Lord. People will be continually employed in cleansing the land. Second time it's talking about the cleansing part of the land and an employment about it. They will spread out across the land and along with others, and they will bury any bodies they are lying on the ground. After 7 months, they will carry out a more detailed search. As they go through the land, anyone who sees a human bone will leave a marker beside it until the gravediggers bury it in the valley of Haman, Gog, near a town called Hamanah, and so they will cleanse the land. Son of man, this is now speaking back to Ezekiel, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Call out every kind of bird and all the wild animals, assemble and come together from all around to the sacrifice I am preparing for you, the great sacrifice on the Mount of Israel. They will eat flesh and drink blood. You will eat the flesh of mighty men and drink the blood of the princes of the earth, as if they were rams and lambs and goats and bulls, all of them fattened animals from Bashan. All right, now that is allegory. People aren't going to be doing that. The animals and the vultures are going to be eating the flesh and the blood and all that kind of stuff. All right, so there you go. Here's what we're seeing here. Let me give you a picture of where it says about this burial here. I put it in your notes there. I wanted you to see when it says east of the sea, it's talking about the Dead Sea. And so it's as you get right past the Dead Sea, that's the area where the question mark is. Above Moab there is where this valley of Haman is going to be, of Gog. And again, it's the hordes of God is going to be buried there. So let's talk about what we just read. I put in your notes, as you see, a nuclear war, question mark. Most scholars are very comfortable in saying yes, yes, and yes. Okay? The weapons will supply energy for 7 years. What weapons could supply energy except for nuclear weapons? Okay. Professionals will be hired to deal with the cleanup waste. Radioactivity. Is this why it's saying the land has to be cleansed? They will bury the dead east of the Dead Sea, or what I love the old commentaries, or downwind from Israel, so that the winds of this nuclear stuff or any contamination would go south. All right? They will leave markers or signs where the contamination is found. When it said when they find a body and all the rest, what they're supposed to do is mark that site, and they call those that have been hired that have continual employment. They will call them, and they clean that up, and they move it all to this one site or region, the valley of Haman, or Gog, basically, is where they're burying all the evil in one place. And this will become the memorial type place where people will say, there's the remains of that which comes against Israel. So it's a long-standing site that people will look at. This is really important to look at this with some fluidity in this realm, that some people say, could it still be a conventional war? More and more scholars and people in eschatology are saying no, because of the contamination aspect of it all. Okay, that's what the details that are here that shows that there has to be a cleansing, and they need to mark where people are at and get them out of the land, and they use the weapons for fuel. If you notice the way it read, and it wasn't just that they had to clean it up for 7 months, the dead, but that it actually alluded a little bit, did you catch it? That they might have to wait 7 months before they can start the cleaning. Did you catch that back in that? If not, go back and read that several times this week, that not only does it take 7 months to clean it up, but it seems as if they wait, or am I saying 7 months, 7 years? Isn't it years? Let me go back so I can pick that up real quick for you here. It's 7 months that they'll carry out more of the details. It's 7 months that they may actually wait also. So yeah, it's not years, it's 7 months on both of them. So they may wait 7 months, and then they carry it out for 7 months. The waiting is a time period where it's safe to deal with the contamination, is what more of the scholars are leaning towards in that. All right, so this is a futuristic war. If you noticed last week when I started the process of Ezekiel 38 and 39, I said, is this possibly War World 3? Now, if you notice yet, I haven't dealt with the land being on fire yet, the land of Magog, Russia, and the isles that it talks about. We're holding that to the very last part of this here to share that with you in this. And so let's pick up the very last part of it, verses 19 through 29 here. All right. At the sacrifice I am preparing for you, you will eat fat till you are gluttoned, and drink blood till you are drunk. At my table you will eat your fill of horses and riders, mighty men and soldiers of every kind, declares the sovereign Lord. Again, they're not going to become cannibalistic. It is basically saying they're eating the spoils of what these men and these things owned. Okay, so it's an allegory in this realm. I will display my glory among the nations, and all the nations will see the punishment I inflicted. Not Israel. I inflicted, and the hand I laid on them. From that day, there's the day again, the third time. From that day forward, the people of Israel will know that I am the Lord their God. And the nations will know that the people of Israel went into exile for their sins, because they were unfaithful to me. So I hid my face from them and handed them over to their enemies, and they fell by the sword. This is talking about the captivity that presently just is all taking place, the 3 waves. This is actually now moved right back to present day in this, that because of their idolatry and everything else, he handed them over to the sword, and they are dealt with that. It then alludes to the future dispersing of them, as you see, as you pick up in verse 24. I dealt with them according to their uncleanness and their offenses, and I hid my face from them. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will now, here's the key word, restore the fortunes of Jacob. That's why I called this whole chapter Restore. When I see all this battle and stuff, I look for the silver lining in here. I will now restore the fortunes of Jacob and will have compassion on all the people of Israel. I will be zealous for my holy name. They will forget their shame and all the unfaithfulness they showed toward me when they lived in safety in the land with no one to make them afraid. Now, they live in the land with being afraid still today. So you know this is still a futuristic. Israel does not live in its nation without fear of its enemies at this point. So that's how futuristic that one statement is there, okay? Verse 27 again. When I have brought them back from the nations, now we've jumped up past 70 AD when they were dispersed to the nations. When I brought them back from the nations and have gathered them from the countries of their enemies, I will be proved holy through them in the sight of many nations. They will know that I am the Lord their God, for though I sent them into exile among the nations, that it's again pointing to after 70 AD, I will gather them to their land, not leaving any behind. I will no longer hide my face from them, for I will pour out my spirit on the people of Israel, declares the sovereign Lord. Let me again give you a little important thing that as you're reading prophetic scriptures, it's so important that in a passage you can have several time periods, and that's what you just experienced. One where he deals with the present Babylonian captivity and what they're facing right there. One about a future time where the dispersing to nations, which would be 70 AD, and then one in our day in 1948 when he gathered them back from the nations. So you got three time periods that are in this passage right here. Woo! That's why most churches and most pastors don't deal with prophetic scriptures, because they get freaked out that there's the different time periods that can be in one passage. You aren't freaked out by it because you know our model for all this came way back in Isaiah when in 7:22 Isaiah gives the prophecy, unto us a child is born, a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulders. Means Jesus is going to come in the flesh. He's going to be born. He knows his gender. He's male. No confusion about it whatsoever. And then some other time period. This is all in one verse, Isaiah 9:6. The government will be upon his shoulders. Some of the commentaries that I grew up with, and in the time that I went to Bible college, they said, well, Rome was placed upon him because he had to take Rome on and Rome killed him. Well, you could go there if you didn't read the very next verse of Isaiah 9:7. It says, and he will reign from David's throne when the government's upon it. Okay, he never did that when he was here the first time. He didn't reign from David's throne. That's speaking of the futuristic time, the government upon his shoulders and reigning from David's throne. So the scripture is very clear that it can put in one verse two time periods that are now 2,000 years apart. His birth and his reigning that's still in our future. That's the pattern that helps you get through books like Ezekiel, that you can be confident that there are different time periods that it's talking to. Now, what we just heard in this part of it, I love this, God restores. That's the message that we have as hope for our world out there. No matter what's happening, God restores. Now, this actually speaks to the promise of the Jubilee. Here's a shameless little plug. If you didn't read what I wrote on the Jubilee in my book last year, let me give you a little thing about this. There's two things about the Jubilee you need to know. It's about two things that take place: returning and restoring. Now you go, okay, so you're talking to Jews. Jubilee comes to the Christian. We return to our Creator, and He restores us to the human being we're supposed to be without sin in our lives. So Jubilee happens to all those that have God as their Father and Jesus as their Savior, okay? And the Holy Spirit does the work of the returning and the restoring. That's how the Trinity works it all out. Very, very important, because the Jubilee plays a very important role in what we're discussing here in this battle of the invasion of Gog, of the land of Magog. Number 2, the credit for everything is given to God for the victory. He literally got involved. Those that are serious about eschatology says that his involvement is not an allegory. It's not about using, as he does in the Babylonian captivity, he uses Babylon to bring about his will over Israel. Okay? So that's allegory where he says, I brought the wrath upon the temple and destroyed it. And he says that, but he spells it out and says, I used Nebuchadnezzar. Spells it out very clear. In this battle, he spells it out several times very clear. I, God, I, God. The world will know who, not Israel, not another nation to this, that they'll know that God was involved in this. All right, so that point's a very important part, especially since it says this word, the day, several times, okay? So this is not an allegory that some other country is being used. This is God himself getting involved in this. When it describes this great earthquake, it describes an earthquake that the world feels. That's a scary earthquake. I don't like it when I feel it when they're 100 so miles away, and you get that rolling part. I don't want to feel something that the whole world can feel. My hope and plan is I hope we're not here for this part of it. All right. So, restoration in the Jubilee happens in a reverse order of judgment. This is something you need to know about the Jubilee. If you want to read about the Jubilee, you go to Isaiah chapter 60. I didn't put it in your notes, but if you want to read about it, it's the day of the Lord's favor, where he's going to set the captive free. He talks about all the things he's going to do and the process that he uses. Watch how this works. I put it in your notes here in the very next one. In the reverse order of judgment. So number 4, follow the pattern in Israel. In both the Babylonian captivity and in 70 AD, this was the pattern. Okay? What happens and how they come back. The temple fell first. The sacrifices stopped. Jerusalem fell. The nation falls. And then the people are scattered. That's the pattern in the Babylonian captivity. When the temple falls, it's the first to go of all the different things. Then what happens after the temple falls? The sacrifices stop because they don't have a temple. Jerusalem fell, the nation falls, and the people are scattered or taken in captivity in the Babylonian captivity. In 70 AD, they're scattered to all the nations. That's the sequence. So watch what's happened in history. The Jubilee, and by the way, if you haven't gotten the book that I recommended last week, you're really missing out if you want to know some really cool details about the Jubilee. Jonathan Cahn's latest book, The Oracle, deals with 7 aspects of the Jubilee. I did a page and a half on the Jubilee when I wrote about the things that... There's a key verse. If you didn't know this, maybe you needed to know this tonight. And for those that are finding us online, maybe you need to know there's a key verse to all prophecy. Does anybody know where the first prophetic verse came that really set everything into motion? It's in Genesis, chapter 1, verse 14. What day was he creating? The 4th day. He's creating the 4th day. You all know about the 3rd day, the double blessed day. You know that. But the 4th day is the day that he's actually creating time. On the 4th day, he makes the sun and the moon and the stars so that you can, and the NIV spells this out very correctly in this, to mark the sacred times, the days and the months and the years. God places in Genesis 1:14 a prophetic scripture about sacred days, times, months, and years on the day he's creating time. He knows all of them are coming. Now, what are the sacred days and times? The feasts, the 7 feasts, chapter 5 of my book. I know you guys know this because some of you have read it, or actually, you've been using it for going to sleep at night. I know that's true. It's okay. I prayed that God would bless people. I didn't realize it would put them to sleep. All right. So the feasts are the sacred times. There's prophetic meanings within the feast. The Shemitah is the whole reason why they're in this Babylonian captivity. They owed God 70 Shemitahs. That's why Babylon, God's getting all 70 Shemitahs, 490 years of them doing life wrong. The Shemitah is the 7-year time period of trade. So if I'm a Jew and and Bob's a Jew, okay, Bob, we're Jews tonight. I make a short-term loan to you. In the 7th year, I got to forgive your loan if you haven't paid it back. So I'm only supposed to set it out so that you could pay it off in 6 years. In the 7th year, I forgive it. So in the 6th year, I see there's no way you're going to pay it off. I got a lot of money. You've been, maybe we went through hardships and everything else, okay? So I know Paul's a good Gentile boy. So I go to Paul and I say, Paul, I'm going to sell you Bob's loan that I have with him. I'll buy it back after the 7th year is over. I'll buy it. I'm going to sell it to you. You're going to get money from him for that 7th year, and then I'm going to buy it back. This is the way Jews are. Very frugal people is what they say. What they were doing, they were disobeying God's law of how life was supposed to work. And they thought they were just being smart. God calls them on it and says, you've been doing this for 490 years. Okay, every 7th year is a Shemitah. 7 into 490, ding, 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 70. What are they in captivity for in Babylon? 70 years. Guess what? They're in captivity 70 years to the day. God didn't take an extra day. He didn't cut it a day short. He took 70 years of the Shemitah all right there. So he marked the sacred times. The feast, the Shemitah is a sacred time. And the Jubilee, the 50 year, is a sacred time. This is what we're talking about in here is the Jubilee, the sacred time that he's restoring. That's the two key words in Jubilee. To return and restore. And he says he's restoring here. So that's very, very important. So watch what he did here in our not so distant past. What happened? The first thing that went away was the temple. It's not back. Look at the last thing. The people were scattered. He does the Jubilee in the reverse order. So the last thing that was done was they were scattered is the first thing that gets fulfilled. They're drawn back to the land. What's the next thing that happens? The next to the last thing was they were no longer a nation. The scattered people come back, they become a nation. But they don't have their capital. The UN says you can be the state of Israel, but you can't have Jerusalem as your capital. On the Jubilee in 1967, the 6-day war, when the enemies try to attack them, God, in a Jubilee year, brings back the next step of restoration. Jerusalem's the capital. But it's only part way to the capital. They can occupy it, but the world's not going to recognize it. It takes another 50 years of a Jubilee, and the Jubilee has a really cute aspect to it. There's always the trump that sounds for the Jubilee to declare the 50 years, that everything returns to its original possession. And in December 6, 2017, the Trump sound, President Trump, and said, I am not signing the waiver here this month of the six-month waiver. We are moving from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. It is their capital. In the Jubilee year of 2017, with only days left to that year, the Trump sounded. Does God have a sense of humor or what? So I'm telling you, Merkava, their chariots, their missile system is arrows, and the Trump will sound for a Jubilee. He moves it back, and you know what that does? That fulfills the Jubilee that when you see the restoration of Jerusalem, all cities will talk about one city, all nations will talk about one city before the Messiah returns. The city will be Jerusalem. So Jerusalem's now as a capital. The next thing that left before the very first thing that left was the temple. The next thing was sacrifices. September 25th. It's already been out in the news. Israel has gotten permission. They've even gotten 70 world leaders in different aspects to agree that on September 25th, they are going to do their first animal sacrifice in honor of the day that Noah did his sacrifice off the ark. They call it the sacrifice of promise. On September 25th, 2019. So there's the restoration of the sacrifices are coming back. Folks, the only thing that needs to be restored for the total Jubilee is the temple being built. All the rest have already come back. Do you see why when he says, I will restore and the world will know, you know already? It's just a done deal. That temple's coming, folks. So he's done all the rest of the parts of the Jubilee. So let's talk about God's timing here in closing, all right? First, it's always perfect that this reveals his involvement. His timing reveals his involvement. The second, this invasion has 3 suggested time periods. The scholars do not all agree on the time period of when this invasion takes place. I'm going to give you the 3 right here. The first comes to set up the Antichrist peace offering to many nations for 7 years. Daniel foretold, Daniel's in the captivity, by the way, he foretells that there will be a peace treaty made by one man with many nations, and one of those nations is Israel. Most people always think the peace treaty is only made with Israel. It's a peace treaty made with many nations. So the first, and probably about 45% of the scholars go, this is the war that comes so that this peace treaty will be set up. Okay? The second timing, they say it comes as a part of the War of Armageddon. They will tell you, can I tell you, I agree with all 3 of them, so I believe it's all going to pan out somewhere. Okay? But the second one, it says that when you hear this, and this is the day I talked about, the day of the earthquake and the demon king of war being destroyed, many of the second camp believe this is the return of Jesus Christ to the earth here. It's when his feet hit the Mount of Olives, the earthquake takes place. That's what they see that's not written in Ezekiel, but written in other places, like Zechariah, Isaiah, and Jeremiah. And so that they believe that's where this timing comes in. Okay, there's a third one. The third is it comes in prior to the rapture because it deals with what I put off to the very end. Fire is going to come in the land of Magog and it's going to come in the land of isles. That's what the King James says, the isles, and the NIV says the coastal lands. The isles to the Jews at this time were the furthest civilization from Israel. Many scholars believe that this could mean when this war takes place, there's a nuclear war exchange, and the fire is what's happening in Russia because of their nuclear weapons and what's happening in Great Britain and the United States. That's where they go with it. That's the smallest camp. That's why I put it third. But they say that's the isles being destroyed. Could that come prior to the rapture, that the United States and Russia is taken out of the equation, and that all of a sudden we got the 2 major kingpins, and all of a sudden the only real world leader out there is that which could have an army that the Bible foretells about an army of 200 million. Some say India could do that already, but most people think that could be China. India doesn't have the powerhouse of the military that China does. Okay, so all that is, remember, that's prediction fulfillment. We don't go there. I'm showing you the patterns that you're seeing. The patterns of the Jubilee, the restoration, the pattern of the Shemitah. That's why we're in this captivity Babylon time. The patterns of the feast, how it foretells that there's a Passover. The blood was put on the door so that the death angel would go over it. And then more than 1,500 years later, Jesus becomes the Passover lamb, that his blood applied to our lives and death will pass over us. We go from this life to eternal life. So you're seeing the patterns in that. Here it is. I can't tell you which one is the best. I can tell you all 3 of them. I can find scriptural grounds for all 3. When it's not that clear, it means that God hasn't given us the ability to know that in certainty. But we do know the season is coming. For the first time, Iran and Russia were enemies. They're the two major ones in this war against in the invasion of Gog and Magog to Israel. Iran and Russia are in a very deep pact. The missing key that scholars have been waiting for decades and decades is Turkey. Turkey has been our ally, the United States and NATO, for a long time. They're ticked at us and they're ticked at everything, and they're buying supplies and getting things from who now? Russia. Okay? And so the other countries have been in play for a long while. Turkey and Iran becoming in cahoots with Russia makes all this possible because those other nations have been lined up against Israel for a while. All right? So that's where we're at tonight. All right.